I won't bore you over and over and over and over and over again. We're talking too much about what's been happening in Perth. But how can we not talk about the diet of hysteria that the good people of Perth have been fed for a long time, that of course their local politicians try to make the most of when it comes to this lockdown. A lockdown that has, of course, produced, we'll get to that in a second. But here has been part of the media diet that people have been fed in Perth about the Wu flu that's on their doorstep.
You're being forced to stay home because more cases are expected in the coming days.
Turned into a ghost town as venues slam the doors shut.
These mutant strains from overseas, they're not limited to interstate.
Right now, the roads have fallen silent as the first meals in lockdown across the suburbs are served.
You need to be indoors, and police are taking this very seriously.
It's just nice, the school environment. We just wish that this is not happening, but I don't know what to say, really. I thought we're done with COVID.
My favourite is the bloke with the branded Channel 7 mask with the normal people behind him going, OK. Well, the West Australian was screaming today on the behalf of the Premier that patient zero could have infected thousands of people across Perth. So everyone, like the good little dutiful citizens that we are, we were there in the front row, leaning forward. All right, Emperor McGowan, tell me how many hundred people have been infected in the past 24 hours.
Overnight, Western Australia has recorded no further local cases of COVID-19.
None? None. Fingers crossed this will be the case for the rest of the week, but I don't think they're really going to get out of single figures. You know it and I know it. Even the people that this bloke apparently lived with are still in the negative category. We'll see what happens. But of course, what will happen now, because we have to follow the playbook, the songbook, the well-worn cliches of COVID, is that now they're going to turn around and say, well, because of how serious this could have been, we did the right thing by locking everyone down. Emperor McGowan has already started that backpedal, the same one that Premier Marshmallow had to do in South Australia and that idiot in Queensland did after telling people they had to wear masks in their cars just before Christmas.
Obviously, it's highly transmissible. You know, you've seen this everywhere all over the world. This virus is insidious, it's highly transmissible.
Again, you've heard this all day, you've heard everyone talk about it all night. I won't patronise you by taking you through all of the why this is ridiculous. But there are people who've been willing to call them out, including the Deputy Premier in New South Wales.
Earlier this month, Premier McGowan had no problem kicking New South Wales, our health system, criticising us, lecturing us about that the Western Australian model was the perfect model and their model of eradication had been working, that locked borders, their quarantine was much better than the rest of us. And today, of course, they're in a lockdown and Premier McGowan, a little bit of egg on his face.
Nothing says country party like, I'll do an interview in the middle of the field. But good point that he was making. As for Peter Dutton, he too was holding the line of common sense, where you hope normal people are, but you and I both know. While I'm glad you're watching and the people watching this are normal, the people that are freaking out or just loving the idea of watching telly for a week because the Premier's keeping us safe, well, they'll all fall into line. But thankfully, Peter Dutton can call this exactly for what it is. A lovely reminder from the Emperor about why you must vote for him in about 40-something days' time.
In terms of an elimination strategy, it might be a great sort of political slogan, but it's not a realistic approach to this virus.
But I stand by what I said last night, and I'll say it every day during lockdown. As unpopular as it will be with many people in Western Australia, as it was in South Australia, as it was in Queensland. For the common sense people who watch this show, who are the ones who find themselves shaking their head when they hear what their mates say or the garbage that you might end up reading in your social media feeds. This bloke did not do the work. And that's why Perth is in lockdown right now. Now, you know and I know it's very obvious common sense that you don't have to lock down for one case. You don't even have to lock down for a few dozen cases. You know the difference between a spot fire and a bushfire, and yes, potentially every spot fire can become a bushfire if it has the right amount of fuel and if there's enough, okay. But it's specious reasoning to constantly say, because we overreacted to one case, we stopped 8,000 cases, and there's no way to disprove that's the case, but common sense would prove that's the case. This bloke has clearly just been a passenger in National Cabinet for the past year. Because Mark McGowan has sat there week in, week out, month in, month out, and he's heard states that have done it well, done it poorly. He saw what happened with hotel quarantine specifically in Victoria. So it should shock you that the bloke who claimed he had the gold standard, all of that, was actually presiding over a system that wasn't doing the work, that wasn't actually protecting its citizens. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, and I was listening to some talkback radio in Perth today, that's it, no more people, no one should be allowed to fly home. Can I break some news to you? The people who are flying into Australia now and going to 2 weeks of hotel quarantine are your fellow Australians. They're not backpackers going on holidays. They're not international students. These are your fellow Australians wanting to come home to their country in their city. Perfect example is this Australia, who talked about the problems in hotel quarantine as late as this week. This sounds like the worst of Victoria, but this was happening in Western Australia. I kind of look down the hallway and look at the guards. They're sitting on their phones. They'll have their masks below their nose and hanging loose. And the workers were not just in the right PPE. They needed to be protected too. It's not hard to hand out proper masks and show people how to use them if they're wearing one anyway. And perhaps the most devastating line, the line that actually shows that McGowan has locked down Perth because he didn't do the work. If you want a Victorian-style recipe for disaster, this is it. Now, as I said, Mark McGowan, who will win the upcoming election, he'll win the lower house, the upper house, and if they could vent a third chamber, he'll win that too. But we live in a country where you're still allowed to call these people out when they do the wrong thing, and I'll continue to do so. Because this bloke, rather than taking notes at National Cabinet, he was just cruising at National Cabinet. And even when in late December they were discussing problems in hotel quarantine, remember, he was pulling stunts saying, I can't go to Canberra because I might catch the Wu flu from the South Australian Premier. Ridiculous. But there is a question we have to jump on top of, and it's one of the things I'm going to bring up with the Prime Minister in a second, which is the new normal of 2021 one case equals a lockdown? Because that's what happened in Queensland for 3 days. It's what's happening in Perth for 5 days. It wasn't much more than a few cases in South Australia. We shut the border to New Zealand based off a couple of cases. Is the new normal week-long shutdowns? Here's part of what the PM's going to tell you.
We've always said that, this idea of eradication, well, people are coming home. You can't stop Australians coming home.
Yes, I have a very fat neck. But let's also pay attention here too, that another thing I want to talk about with the Prime Minister, and I know that there's a lot of people who have got differing views about the vaccine, but he's going to go out of his way tonight to try to explain why the vaccine is the right thing to do and what controls are in place. That, put simply, the same people who tick off your heart pills are the same people who have ticked off this vaccine. There's no back door, there's no side door, it's the same people, the same process. Again, the PM will be up in a couple of minutes here on Sky News.
In the same way that you used to take your kids to get vaccinated, I remember going with my mum and you walked in and there was that big table of little teaspoons with pink, something pink in there. I got no idea what it was, but she told me I had to take it and then bang, in the arm. And Mum took me to that. Well, I'll take Mum this time. There's a bloke called Professor Skerritt, who heads the Therapeutic Goods Administration, who's gone over the ins and outs of this vaccine backwards and forwards, up and down, every which way, and he's worked out that it's safe to take.
More with the Prime Minister in a second, and I hope that you get something out of these conversations like I do too, which is just a chance to chat to the bloke who's running the country about his thought process, about the way he's making decisions, and we'll get to all of that later. As well, by the way, there's not going to be compulsory vaccination, so you can park all of that as well.